So I was asked to kind of round out this panel by now shifting from the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Nagoya Protocol, and relevant national bilateral ABS laws to a new topic that has been debated at the international level called digital sequence information. And some of you might have already heard of this. This is a placeholder name, digital sequence information, or DSI, that has been developed by negotiators under the CBD. So with that, I've lost my apologies. Okay, the place to start is basically if you're sitting out there in the audience and you're sort of saying, oh, it's all just too confusing. I don't want to go through the Nagoya Protocol, headache. I'm actually just going to take the public sequence databases, public genetic data, and see if I can't get enough information on what's out there in the wild from genetic data rather than having to go through accessing physical samples. And imagine that there were a bunch of policymakers that sort of heard that line of logic, let's say it was back in 2016, then that is really what became the DSI debate, starting at COP16 in Cancun. And although for political reasons, the term is not defined, digital sequence information broadly is understood by most to include genetic data, RNA, DNA, and proteins, almost certainly those that sort of have sequence data, and probably could be extended to include other kinds of molecular data that is derived from the information contained in a genetic resource. And to help you sort of understand what negotiators were looking at and, pardon me, why there was and is still a call for benefit sharing from DSI, the first observation was made that when the Nagoya Protocol was negotiated or adopted back in 2010, in the decade that followed, there was an exponential increase in the amount of sequence data in the public databases. And of course, with the wide explosion of whole genome sequence data and things like the short read archive, the SRA, there are even more data than this graph can display. And on top of that, under the CBD, there was another stream of negotiation called synthetic biology. And their negotiators were learning about all of the cool tools and toys that scientists in the lab had developed to be able to edit things basically using data from in silico sources and biotech tools like CRISPR-Cas9 to be able to take data from public databases, take SynBio tools, and to basically be able to avoid the Nagoya Protocol, not have to come back and access physical materials. And so the policy debate was to say, that's a loophole. That's not fair. We agreed to the Nagoya Protocol in good faith, and this loophole needs to be closed. And the message that, in particular, the DSI Scientific Network, which was founded in 2020, but also colleagues like Manuela and many around the world really put out there in response to this observation, this perceived and real loophole, was that we understand and we support the call for benefit sharing from DSI, but we asked negotiators to please make it as compatible as possible with scientific practices. And that is to learn from the Nagoya Protocol, learn from the past, and to try to create policies for DSI that were amenable, that were like how scientists normally use sequence data. And in a project funded by the German Ministry for Research and Education, colleagues at MVIF39 and at Leibniz Institute IPK, and several others, we did a paper called Myth Busting, the Provider-User Relationship. And what we really tried to do here was to bring to policymakers empirical data about how DSI, how sequence data is cited in scientific publications and where that sequence data came from. Not where it was sequenced, but where the original country of origin was. And in this sort of linear presentation, the relationship between providing and using, we noted there are no countries that are only provider countries of DSI, of genetic resources that give rise to sequence data. And there are no countries that are only using. And what this tells us is that as a scientist, if I'm sitting in any continent in the world, if I'm using data, I am both a provider and user on average. And the idea that is often spoken about in policy negotiations is I'm a provider country, I'm a user country. And in fact, the science, the way that open data is used shows us that there actually are no only provider and there are no user countries, but in fact, we're all providers and we're all users. And in fact, when we dug into the data a little bit more, we also see that scientists tend to use their local data more than foreign data. So if you look at the largest block of users, so for example, take the fourth column, GRULAC, which is the Latin American region. The biggest use of DSI for which the genetic resource came from Latin America is GRULAC users, right? And that trend applies to every single column here. The biggest users of Asian Pacific DSI, that's the second column, are also those users, that biggest group of users, Asian Pacific, matches the region, Asia Pacific, from where the country of origin came. And this actually makes total sense, right? I tend to do more research, more citations of data that I got locally than I did from somewhere far away. But this tells us also, when speaking to policymakers, that what we were really interested in is not this DSI framework or DSI policy decisions that limit the ability of, let's say, a South African scientist to be able to use South African genetic data, but recognize that that South African scientist is very much a user as well as a provider. And that there is no simple solution like you just put a paywall on top of GenBank and then everything's solved, because actually that would have perverse consequences that in those more resource limited settings where perhaps you can't afford a paywall, you would not have access to GenBank. And so we really tried to advise policymakers on those solutions that would be important. And I've mentioned this a couple of times. So the DSI Scientific Network is a group of now, actually, I need to update this slide, over 100 members from, I think, 33 countries from all UN regions. And we really work collectively to identify those issues that are most relevant for non-commercial users of DSI, and to conduct webinars, briefings, and to really engage directly, taking our scientific knowledge and engaging into the policy process. Our main focus over the past several years has been on the Convention on Biological Diversity, which we're working on here, but are also working in the FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organization and its plant treaty, as well as the World Health Organization and its negotiations on pathogen access and benefit sharing. I've seen some messages in the chat, as well as the new High Seas Treaty, biodiversity beyond national jurisdictions, where there are also benefit sharing provisions. And this was sort of a seminal paper produced by many members of the network back in 2020 in advance of the COP16 negotiations, in which we really said, for us, the most important design criteria is that a DSI benefit sharing mechanism is not bilateral, like the Nagoya Protocol, where every country decides its own individual rules, because the sheer amount of data and the interconnectedness of the data, the fact that you need to compare sequences to understand them, means that a bilateral system won't work, that a multilateral system in which every country participates in one system with one set of rules is the only way that we really thought it would be possible to have effective benefit sharing. And in that paper, we outlined some additional principles. We talked about open access, the importance of open data, and that rather that access be the trigger point for benefit sharing, that we would need a decoupled approach in which we have open access and benefit sharing happens downstream. For simplicity, because the science around DSI is very complicated, but the legal framework cannot burden that complexity. For harmonization with other international treaties that I had just listed earlier, for a relationship to the biodiversity and to the global biodiversity framework's goals, and for the role of DSI databases to provide fairness and to transparency, but not to make databases the ABS police in which they're monitoring where every single piece of data came from and checking ABS permits, which were proposals that were considered. And in December of 2022 at COP15, in which in parallel to the DSI negotiations, the Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which is also abbreviated as the KMGBF, was negotiated. And this is sort of like what I had alluded to in the introduction talk, where the Aichi targets were negotiated with the Nagoya Protocol. There was very clear statements from several negotiators that there would be no KMGBF unless there was a deal on DSI. And so in some ways, you can sort of think that these parallel negotiations kind of hold each other hostage. And one of the reasons that COP15 was a success is because at a previous meeting in Geneva in the spring of 2022, they were able to agree on what became known later as the Geneva Principles. And most important probably for this community are the principles around not hindering research and innovation, being consistent with open access to data, and mutual supportiveness with other ABS instruments. But that decision to establish a multilateral mechanism based upon the principles was kind of everything and nothing, because it left all of the operationalization, all of the decisions about how this will actually work until last year at COP16 in October 2024. And between 2022 and 2024, there were a number of in-person working groups, so formal negotiations where parties come together and try to focus in on how they want to operationalize. A number of us were involved in the CBD's informal advisory group, in which parties, negotiators, as well as certain stakeholder groups, including academia, were represented. There were 3 studies done, peer reviews, lots of informal dialogues, webinars, retreat, etc. And in parallel to that, the DSI Scientific Network produced a number of knowledge products as part of the informal process, with funding from a lot of funding from NORAD, from the Norwegian Development Agency, in partnership with the Meridian Institute, as well as a number of additional projects led by different members. And these kind of give you an overview of the topics that policymakers were interested in, and in fact, I think in the other ABS instruments are still interested in. And we also organized a side event in Montreal, one of the preparatory meetings also in Geneva the year before. You can see Manuela there in the middle, sitting 2 chairs down from myself, as well as a number of others. And then a side event also at COP16. There are a number of colleagues in the bottom left, Douglas Miano from Kenya and Maria Mercedes Zambrano from Colombia, the host country as well. And here you can see that this changes from a sort of formal meeting room to now a tent. And that's actually how COPs, the Conference of the Parties meetings are, is they're on site, and then there's lots of sort of ad hoc buildings, and we got stuck in a tent a little bit farther outside the venue. That's okay. It was still a nice event. And these are what the formal negotiations look like at a COP. And with that, I'd like to tell you now, hopefully the question that you were hoping I would tell you 10 minutes ago, which is what actually happened at COP16. Can I still use public DSI databases? Do I have new benefit sharing obligations? So the structure of the negotiations during COP16, the co-chairs, that's Will Lockhart from the United Kingdom and Patso from Kalemba from Malawi, structured it in the money in contributions and the money out, the allocations. And on the money in negotiation side, they were trying to figure out who should pay. Should it be all users? How much? By products or by sectors? How? And the money out, who should get the money? And then the issues that were very important to us were such as the role of DSI databases, this police question, non-monetary benefit sharing, so sharing benefits but not having to do with money, as well as governance issues. Those received a lot less attention, and most of the negotiating space was designated to the money in, money out topics. Ultimately, parties agreed to a new multilateral mechanism and established the Cali Fund. The scope of that mechanism is publicly available DSI, digital sequence information, for which the sharing of benefits is not provided for by other ABS international agreements. Who should pay? Users of DSI in sectors that directly or indirectly benefit from its use in their commercial activities. And only those users that reach a certain financial threshold, that is, and they should pay 1% of profits or 0.1% of revenue if they beat 2 out of 3 financial thresholds, namely $20 million in assets, 50 million in sales, or 5 million in profit. And so you can see the effort here, and the Brazilian negotiator referred to this as the big fish approach, where you're really trying to target large multinational companies that are very clearly, users of DSI, make profits, to get them into the new multilateral mechanism. That's the focus. And then at COP17 and beyond, whether or not they propose additional financial thresholds to potentially include medium and small companies is something that's open, that likely will happen. And another really important note for Indigenous peoples and local communities, IPLCs, that at least half of the Cali Fund will go towards IPLCs in a mix of both project-based and direct allocations. Here's a picture from a recent publication that hopefully tries to break this down. So on the left is the bilateral access and benefit sharing that you've been hearing about for the last 40 minutes. And that stays in place. That is still there. On the right-hand side is the new DSI mechanism. And so if your Nagoya permit allows you to share sequences into the public data space, then once that data becomes public, it is now into the multilateral mechanism for benefit sharing. Non-commercial users must share non-monetary benefits. They have no obligations to share monetary benefits. Commercial users have an obligation to share both monetary and non-monetary benefits, including payments into the Cali Fund. And I'm happy to take more questions, but just to give the bigger picture. So the CBD decision is now operationalized. There is now a new DSI benefit sharing mechanism. And there are several other ongoing negotiations in other United Nations fora, in particular under the WHO, the FAO, and the UN Convention of the Law of the Seas, New High Seas Treaty, BBNJ. All of that data is available in the public DSI database, and how and whether or not those rules can exist nicely together remains unknown, which is one of the reasons that the DSI Scientific Network last year published a new paper in Nature Communications on how and why it is essential for researchers to have one harmonized system on DSI benefit sharing, ideally in which commercial users could pay into one pot like the Cali Fund, and money could be sent out multiple windows into different funds as one option. And at the very least, that they would have similar rules around the scope of DSI and recognize the importance of open access so that we non-commercial users could continue to use the public data sets as one global resource. There are a lot of ongoing negotiations. You can read more about it at this paper down here in the bottom. But in general, in particular, in the field in the world of BBNJ and FAO, there will be some very active DSI negotiations this year. And assuming that the World Health Assembly passes the negotiated text coming out of the most recent WHO negotiations, there is very likely to be a working group or an expert group on pathogen access and benefit sharing that will also begin over the next year. And so while in some ways CBD is on a brand new adventure, it has made some clear decisions. The other 3 UN fora are still open-ended. And as a final note, just what else can be done here? There are still 2 topics for non-commercial users of digital sequence information that are needed. Number 1, on non-monetary benefit sharing. This was given no attention at the negotiations. We need to just demonstrate what non-monetary benefits come from open data, from open DSI, and we need to count that. We need to show that we are engaged in contributing, because if things don't work and if parties someday come to new agreements, then it is very likely that the academic exemption from paying could be reconsidered. The other topic is on database governance, so sequence databases. There are a lot of changes asked by parties of DSI databases. but many of those databases have no idea that they're affected or impacted. And so I think there's a lot of awareness raising and outreach that needs to be done for databases. We've begun some of that working in partnership with the Global Biodata Coalition and the FAR DSI project, but there is a lot more sensitivization that needs to be done. And with that, I want to say thank you to the different funders and partners, and happy to turn it back over to you, Arna. Oh, and the people.